Hello everyone, and welcome back to Gone Legends. In today's video, we will be honoring American celebrities who sadly passed away today and over the last few days, as well as notable figures from around the world whose loss has touched many. Before we begin, we would truly appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like this video. Your kindness helps us continue sharing these stories. Thank you. And now, let us start.
Scott Adams arrived into the modern imagination in a way that feels almost inevitable, as if there had always been a man drawing the small, bitter hilarities of office life and waiting for someone to notice. Born in 1958, he grew into an observer by disposition, a man who watched the machinery of daily work and learned to hear the tiny misalignments between what people said they believed and how they actually behaved. He turned those misalignments into a language. And that language became Dilbert, the comic strip that crystallized a generation's frustration with fluorescent lights, with middle managers, with the invisible architecture of corporate absurdity. When the first Dilbert strips hit newspapers, something shifted. Adams had found a moral geometry for the cubicle, a way to render the petty cruelties and comic tragedies of office life as a cartoon that felt like autobiography to millions. Dilbert himself, the bespectacled engineer with a paperclip heart, became a mirror in which cubicles saw themselves honestly for the first time. It was not only the punchlines that cut, it was the persistent eye for the small betrayals of modern work, the memo that meant nothing, the meeting that meant no action, the manager who celebrated process over people. Adams's voice was acid and comfort at once. Readers laughed because they recognized the truth of it. Adams's craft was deceptively simple. His drawings were lean, economical, a few lines, a flat office floor, an inhuman reactive machine called the corporate ladder. But within those lines lived a lifetime of study, of human foibles, of corporate rituals, of the strange gospel of efficiency that sacrifices people to numbers. Adams did not write treatises on work. He wrote shorthand. Dilbert was, in its best moments, a small moral philosophy wrapped in humor, a textbook of the lived experience of being under someone else's fluorescent lights. Beyond the paper, Adams expanded his voice into books, into animated adaptations, into public appearances. He built a brand that reflected the reach of his ideas, the painful bliss of recognition when a joke names your life. Yet even as Dilbert became global, the comic never lost that intimacy. It remained an act of companionship, a fellow passenger in the daily commute, a whisper that said, "Yes, I know." That is perhaps Scott Adams's true achievement, that he could take the humdrum and make it human, that the small betrayals of offices became something to be held and understood rather than merely endured. Through decades of national conversation, through controversies and reinvention, Adams's work forced us to ask a quiet question: what is dignity at work? His cartoons insisted that dignity was not a corporate slogan, but the little insistences of people doing honest things in systems that often forgot them. That insistence rippled beyond the paper. Managers began to be seen with a new skepticism. Engineers and clerks and secretaries were granted voices in the collective imagination that had been quieted for too long. For many, Dilbert was not simply entertainment but recognition, a momentary lifting of the veil. In the end, Scott Adams's legacy is not simply a body of strips or a series of best-selling books. It is a posture he taught us to take toward the structures that govern daily life. He taught us how to laugh with a clarity that looked like critique, how to see the human in the schematic, how to find compassion beneath a strip of black ink. In his last years, in the slow and private narrowing of attention that illness brings, he remained, as always, an observer, though now the observer was also observed. Remembered by millions who carried his small cartoons like talismans. When news came on January 13, 2006, that Scott Adams had died after a battle with prostate cancer, the world felt oddly quieter. The cubicle lamps dimmed in memory. Yet even in that dimness, the lines of his drawings kept their small, unflinching truth. For anyone who ever felt a meeting swallow their afternoon, for anyone who ever sat under the hum of fluorescent lights and felt unseen, Scott Adams taught one simple salvation: to name it. He gave us the language to say, "This is what this is." There is a consolation in that truth. And so his work endures not as a monument, but as a mirror, always ready to reflect the human face of our everyday labor. Victoria Jones's life was framed first by lineage and then by her own urgent refusal to be only a reflection of it. Born in 1992, she came of age in the shadow of one of Hollywood's rough-hewn legends, the actor Tommy Lee Jones. Yet Victoria's gift was not a borrowed spotlight. It was a hunger to craft her own story in an industry predisposed to remake the living into images. She chose acting as a way into that independence and did it with a mixture of bravery and quiet craft. On set, she was often the same person she was off camera, attentive, small in gesture, but voluminous in presence. She moved through roles with an economy that revealed rather than revealed her. The arc of her career was not meteoric but meaningful. She drew attention not by becoming a headline but by building a body of work that suggested a patient artist. Her performances often leaned into the interior, a look held too long, a hand that trembled with unspoken history, an instant when the camera found something on the verge of breaking and refused to look away. Critics praised her not for grandiosity, but for the way she made the ordinary feel like revelation. Audiences responded because she seemed recognizable, not as celebrity offspring, but as someone whose grief, joy, and small victories were genuinely human. Victoria's life, tragically, was cut short on January 1, 2010. The particulars of her death remain the subject of investigation, and the absence of certainty has left both family and fans suspended in a kind of waiting. Yet from what we do know, what we can say with tenderness and without speculation is that she lived with an intensity that made those around her feel discovered. In interviews, she spoke of the pressures of legacy and the strange kindness of small roles. She believed that acting was a craft of listening, of giving space for the audience to find themselves in the margins. That belief informed everything she did. She did not seek to dominate a scene so much as to open it. Her legacy, therefore, is quiet but deep. For a generation of young actors wrestling with parentage and profession, Victoria's path offered a model. Pursue your own discipline, accept the obligations of lineage without becoming a copy. Let the work itself be the arbiter. In the wake of her passing, colleagues have spoken of her steadiness, her capacity to remember names and details, the small kindnesses that make long shoots bearable. She carried with her the old Hollywood's grit and the new cinema's desire for authenticity. She will be remembered not only as Tommy Lee Jones's daughter, but as an artist who insisted on being seen for who she was. There is a particular ache in the way a young life ends before it has had a chance to gather the weight of history. Yet the work Victoria left behind, films and performances that will continue to be found by new viewers, carries a simple, stubborn vitality. Each of those moments on screen will be, for someone, the first time they see that particular light reflected back. In that reflection, a small human truth remains: legacy is not simply inherited, it is made. Victoria made hers by attending, by listening, and by giving us performances that felt like gifts. That is how she will live on. Jim McBride's songs were, in the best sense, country in the oldest meaning of the word. They were maps of people's lives, charting the small heartbreaks and stubborn joys of the ordinary. Born in 1948, he was a late-blooming instrumentalist who taught himself more than he learned in class. He picked up a guitar at 21, and from that first moment of stumbling chords, a songwriter's ear found its place. What followed was a quiet, patient apprenticeship in honky-tonks and living rooms, in the kitchens of small towns and the studios of Nashville, until his lines found the radio, and with them the country's attention. McBride's partnership with Alan Jackson is the stuff of music business lore. Together they shaped an era of country that sounded both timeless and immediate. Songs like Chattahoochee did more than sell records. They became anthems for the lives of small towns and summer rivers, for the rites of passage that feel both private and shared. McBride found that rare thing a songwriter hopes for, the ability to write in a voice that sounded simultaneously personal and universal. He didn't write for the charts so much as for the kitchen tables where the songs would be sung back into the air by others. The songwriter's craft is often underestimated. The public hears the singer and forgets the hand that wrote the melody and the line. Jim McBride was that hand. His catalog is full of songs that are deceptively simple, that on first listening seem familiar because they are made of the same materials as life memory, longing, small triumphs. The emotional truth of his music lay in detail, a place name, a particular way of remembering a summer. These details made his songs feel like inherited objects. Over the years, his peers honored him. The Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame and other institutions recognized not only his commercial successes but his deep influence on writers who followed. When his sudden death was reported on January 6, 2026, the country music community paused. Alan Jackson and others spoke not only of a collaborator but of a friend who had guided careers and opened doors. There is a story told in different forms about the way McBride encouraged young writers, about the generosity of someone who knew how to teach the craft without stealing the voice. That generosity is a kind of afterlife for a songwriter. Each new writer he inspired is another verse of his work continued. Jim's songs remain in record players and set lists, in the vocal inflections of singers who took his lines and made them their own. He gave the genre more than singles. He gave it a vocabulary for remembering the places that make us who we are. In his music, hometowns become mythic, and the passage of time becomes a refrain. The suddenness of his end is a hard thing to reconcile with a life of patient composition. But if there is consolation, it is that his songs keep speaking. They will be there when the lights go down at the end of a show, a bright echo of an ordinary, generous life. P.K. Carter's face and voice carried an unmistakable warmth and unpredictable electricity. Born in 1957, he arrived at an era in American cinema and television when the comic supporting actor could suddenly hold his own against marquee names, turning a scene into a living moment by the force of personality. Carter had that force. He understood timing, not merely comedic timing, but the human timing of a pause that revealed a lifetime. He could make you laugh and ache, sometimes in the same breath. Carter's career threaded through some of the most beloved and most strange pieces of popular culture. In John Carpenter's The Thing, he was part of a company of actors who brought claustrophobic dread to life. And in family television and comedy, he found a way to make character work feel immediate and essential. He showed up in roles that required him to be more than a joke. He was often the heart, the humanizing counterpoint to the plot. Whether he was delivering a punchline or holding a frightened silence, Carter's presence suggested a backstory, a history that made the world of the film larger and truer. The public often knows actors by one role, but colleagues and fans who watched closely saw Carter's range. He could be zany without losing grounding. He could be tender without sentimentality. That balance made his characters feel like real people, not merely comic devices. It's an under-celebrated art to make a supporting role feel necessary to give it weight that the plot cannot afford to lose. Carter mastered that art. When he was found dead at home on January 9, 2026, the community that had loved and worked with him responded with quiet grief. In the absence of a disclosed cause, the stories that poured out were not clinical. They were full of anecdote and gratitude. Directors spoke of an actor who arrived to set prepared but open to surprise. Co-stars remembered someone who could lift the mood of a long day and then anchor a scene with a single, perfectly placed gesture. The industry's tribute spoke not only of talent but of the manner in which Carter used it as a way to make movies humane. P.K. Carter's legacy is the small human truths he carved into American film and television. He is the actor you return to when you want to be reminded how a look can say more than a paragraph, how a laugh can contain both joy and sorrow. He taught audiences that characters do not exist only to advance plot, they exist to awaken empathy. And that is a kind of immortality, the moment a viewer recognizes themselves in a face on screen and feels a little less alone. Carter gave us many such moments. Those moments, now multiplied by remembrance, are how he will live on. Guy Moon's music moved like laughter, quick, precise, and impossible to forget. As a composer for animation, he inhabited a rare and important territory, the soundscape that sits between childhood and memory, that teaches rhythm and emotional architecture to whole generations. Born in 1963, he found his way into studios where the demand was not just for jingles but for music that could carry character, impulse, and heart in 30-second bursts. He wrote themes and scores that did something extraordinary. They made television feel alive in the ear and in the body. Moon's best-known work for the Fairly OddParents did more than give a show a theme. It gave a world a heartbeat. Cartoons live or die by rhythm. The rise and fall that tells a joke, the motif that accompanies a character's entrance, and Moon understood this like a poet. His music was playful without ever being frivolous. It cued emotion, the way a director cues an actor, exact, generous, and always with respect for the audience. In the theaters of late-night TV and Saturday morning animation, his melodies lodged themselves in memory, and for children growing into adults they became markers of particular afternoons and friendships. Beyond the theme songs and the fanfare, Moon worked as a collaborator in the studio. able to speak the language of directors and animators and to translate movement into melodic contour. His music taught generations the grammar of mood, when to lean into suspense, when to float in wonder, when to let a small, triumphant figure state a motif and feel victorious. For composers who came after, Guy Moon's catalog is a textbook in precision and generosity. For viewers, his music will continue to be an audible bridge to childhood, to the way the world looked and felt in a million living rooms. In animation especially, the composer's job is often invisible, but disappearance cannot erase influence. Moon's themes will continue to signal the arrival of mischief, of wonder, of the exact kind of heart that children's stories need. In the ledger of a life in music, there is a special place for those who write for pictures, the people who make images sing. Guy Moon will be remembered for making images sing better than anyone else in his field, for crafting melodies that taught us how to laugh with our ears. His work lives as long as cartoons are watched and as long as melodies are hummed on rainy afternoons. Alfredo Al Pacino, born in 1940, is one of those rare actors whose face and voice seem almost carved for the work, a presence that can shift from tenderness to cruelty with a single breath. Across decades, he turned private hunger into public truth, finding grandeur in the smallest gestures and teaching generations of performers how to be bravely honest and deeply humane. His career is less a list of roles than a map of devotion to preparation, moral risk, and the tiny moments that tell us who we are. Al Pacino was born Alfredo James Pacino on April 25, 1940, in the quartered light of East Harlem, New York City. The exact coordinates of his childhood, the blocks he ran, the stoops where boys learned to measure themselves against each other, are important only for the way they fed an imagination already attuned to story. He grew up amid the hum and bite of Italian-American life, kitchens smelling of garlic and tomatoes, conversations that folded easily into argument, elders who kept their heads and their stories. The city, with its neighborhoods and noises, is a constant character in any telling of Pacino's life. The rhythm of trains, the cadence of street vendors, the way people moved through hard times, all of that found its way into the actor's body. From the beginning, he was less a child of privilege than of attention. He learned early to watch, to listen, to store away the inflections and grievances of real people, so that when the moment came to be someone else, he could draw on a deep-lived catalog. There was an early restlessness to Pacino that found an outlet in performance. He attended the High School of Performing Arts in Manhattan, a crucible for young talent where the bright and the desperate meet in equal measure. The discipline of the stage settled him in a way that the street could not. It opened a door into language as muscle. He studied under teachers who demanded rigor, improvisation that was honest, work that moved beyond mimicry into truth. Later, he would train with master teachers such as Lee Strasberg and the great Stella Adler, absorbing an approach to acting that prized imagination and the actor's moral responsibility to a character. Those years in the studio taught him two things that would become his hallmark: an absolute devotion to preparation and a refusal to smother spontaneity. Pacino's method was not the brittle ritual of technique alone. It was the combination of a mapped interior life and a willingness to live dangerously within it, to let unseen feelings come to the surface in ways that felt unpredictable and real. His early years in the theater were not immediate triumphs but long, hungry seasons of apprenticeship. Off-Broadway stages and small companies gave him a ground on which to test himself, to be brave without the softening safety of a camera's close-up. He was drawn to roles that asked for moral complexity, parts that demanded not merely skill but courage. In those rooms he learned the discipline of listening, the tiny mechanics of entrance and exit, the way a line could be made to breathe. Directors and fellow actors soon noticed here was someone who could electrify a room while remaining astonishingly precise. That reputation led to small film roles, to television appearances, and finally to the kind of breakthrough that in the movies requires equal parts talent and alignment. And then came the film that would move the axis of his life, a story of family and power, of loyalty and cold, of a young man pulled into the centrifugal force of inheritance. When Francis Ford Coppola cast Pacino as Michael Corleone in The Godfather in 1972, the choice did not look obvious on paper. Here was an actor of the theater, slight and intense, given the chance to embody a figure who begins the tale as a stranger to his family's crimes and ends it as the architect of an empire of violence. Pacino's performance is a study in transformation. He played Michael not as a cartoon or as obvious caricature, but as a man whose very reserve masks the slow ignition of ambition. Observe the way Pacino lets the silence hang, a small smile that is practiced for cruelty, a slow, deliberate swallowing that becomes the mechanical beat of calculation. The role required an enormous control of tone and timing, and Pacino supplied it with a ferocity that reshaped an industry's expectations of leading men. He made Michael Corleone not glamorous but terrible, not noble but inevitable. In doing so, he moved the mechanics of acting into the public imagination. Audiences did not merely watch Michael, they felt the quiet, terrifying logic of his ascent. What makes Pacino's early work arresting is not simply surface bravado but his capacity to hold contradiction. In The Godfather, he is both the youthful soldier and the man who learns to shut off feeling like a valve. In the films that followed Serpico, where he played Frank Serpico, the cop who fought the rot inside the force, Dog Day Afternoon, where his portrayal of Sonny Wartzik rendered a desperate heist into a confession of loneliness, he continued to carve roles out of raw human need. Sidney Lumet's Dog Day Afternoon is notable, not only for its plot, but for the way it rests on Pacino's shoulders. He converts the grotesque and the comedic into one weird, bruised humanity. To watch Pacino in these years is to observe an appetite for moral truth. He is not satisfied with what is easy, with what flatters. He searches instead for those moments in which a person's inner life bleeds unwillingly into the light. Through the 1970s, Pacino's star rose, but his ambitions remained rooted in craft. He refused to be typecast, leaping from organized crime to the lone cop, from stage roles to melodramatic film. He made choices that were sometimes controversial and sometimes perplexing in an era when overexposure could flatten a career. Yet his risk-taking was never mere headline chasing. Even in films that were not universally loved, Pacino's work radiated an integrity. He chose characters that would trouble him, that would demand an ongoing excavation. That decade cemented his reputation as an actor who would not rest on the laurels of a single great performance. He wanted a body of work that read like a long, engaged essay on human contradiction. The 1980s brought both triumph and struggle. Pacino moved into the realm of iconography with Brian De Palma's Scarface, a film that, for better or worse, reaped the rewards of excess. His portrayal of Tony Montana, a man propelled by paranoia and appetite, who seizes power and then loses himself in it, entered the culture like an electric shock, Pacino's Montana was an opera of violence and bravado, a figure who seems to hold all the world in his clenched fist, only to be undone by the very thing he sought to own. Some critics have derided Scarface for its raw, sometimes ugly spectacle, yet there is no denying the performance's magnetism. It is Pacino unafraid of the grotesque, willing to pour every ounce of craft into a role that demanded both theatricality and a kind of naked desperation. That theater of extremes could sometimes cost him critical favor in the more delicate arenas of film art. The public, however, responded with a mixture of fascination and affection. Pacino had, by then, become one of those actors whose name carried with it a set of expectations, that he would be intense, that he would not settle for half measures. He cultivated his craft with an almost monastic intensity. Directors knew that to work with Pacino was to be taken to the edge of a role's possibilities. Colleagues respected him because he gave the work everything he had, and because he expected of himself what he expected of them. Then, in a career that read like a rhythm of crest and renewal, came a moment that was both personal vindication and public correction. In 1992, Al Pacino won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade in Scent of a Woman. The film is anchored by a man who, blinded and furious, navigates the moral swamp of his life with a mix of rage and aphorism. Pacino's performance in that film is a case study in timing and restraint. When he needs to thunder, he thunders. When the character must seem defenseless, he disappears into tenderness. It is the sort of role that invites the actor to be audacious without cruelty, to be theatrical and tender in the same breath. The Oscar honored more than a single performance. It was, in many ways, a symbol of an actor's persistence of decades spent refusing to trade intensity for comfort. The award came as recognition that Pacino's relentless pursuit of truth, even in the most melodramatic of canvases, had yielded something quietly profound. The long arc of Pacino's career is notable, not merely for the peaks but for the way he navigated the valleys. He never allowed himself simply to be defined by awards or absence thereof. Instead, he returned, again and again, to the stage, that demanding geometry where his art found one of its truest homes. Broadway and off-Broadway became laboratories for alchemy. There Pacino could rebuild and reinvent. His stage work, often overlooked by those who count only film roles, is crucial to understanding his devotion to craft. The theater kept his muscles limber. It reminded him of the need for presence without artifice. In the same way a musician returns to scales, Pacino returned to the boards to rehearse the small mechanics that create great performance: attentive listening, a vow to the other actor, and the capacity to make every moment feel like the one that matters most. Across decades, Pacino's choices reflected a restless intelligence. He collaborated with directors who could shape his intensity into something exquisitely human, and he walked away from projects that dulled his singular flame. He worked with Francis Ford Coppola, with Sidney Lumet, with Brian De Palma, and in later years with directors who appreciated the particular dangers he brought to a role. He moved into television and miniseries, where mature roles found him ready to excavate complexity, middle-aged men who were haunted not by youthful rage, but by the accumulative knowledge of mistakes and lost affection. He allowed himself the patient work of an actor who sees his own life as a resource. The small fatigues of aging, the softening of voice, the way a face is rewritten with grief and years. Those details are the currency of his later work. They are precisely what make him appear, in his 7th and 8th decades, like an actor who has earned the right to be interesting. To discuss Pacino without speaking of his method is to tell a partial story. He is often described as a method actor. And, for good reason, he digs into a character's logic with a scholar's patience and a devotee's intensity. But Pacino's method was not mechanical. It was an ethic, to search for a character's moral gravity, to imagine details no one else notices, to let anger and tenderness appear as if by accident. He is an actor who trusts the imagination enough to let it produce strange and moving truths. He also trusts silence. Many younger actors fear blankness and hurry to fill it with movement or line. Pacino learned, through hard-earned discipline, to let the silence be full, the beat before a hand reaches for a glass, the moment a man decides whether to tell the truth. Those interstices are where he finds human meaning. Influence is a less measurable but more enduring kind of success, and Pacino's influence is enormous. He reshaped the idea of masculinity on screen, showing that power and tenderness are not opposites, and that vulnerability can be a form of authority. He gave an entire generation of performers permission to be big without being simplistic. Directors learned to write differently when they knew they had an actor capable of mixing noise with the subtlest of feelings. The language of American acting, in short, was altered by his presence. Students in conservatories study his performances not because they are easy to imitate, but because they demand a seriousness of approach that elevates the whole enterprise. Pacino's legacy is also one of generosity in its own way. He has been known to mentor younger actors, to hold the stage as though it were a tent under which many could rehearse. His collaborative spirit, the willingness to be undone by a scene partner and thereby to make them better, is one of the quieter but most consequential marks he has left on the craft. It is easy to imagine him, after a long day of shooting, sitting in a darkened theater somewhere watching work that reminds him why he does it, not for applause, not for awards, but for the essential human exchange that takes place when one person imagines another person's life and, in doing so, offers viewers permission to imagine themselves differently. There is also the note of paradox in Pacino's life, a public man of great ferocity who, in private, has guarded certain intimacies carefully. Fame did not seem to hollow him, rather, it seemed to press him into sharper focus. He has aged visibly on screen, and in doing so, he has taught audiences something crucial about the dignity of years. Many of his later roles ask not what a man will do next, but who he becomes when all the small lies he once needed to survive fall away. Those are roles that require an actor to be neither young nor old, but to be exactly what he is, a vessel of history and regret, and occasionally of modest grace. To speak of Al Pacino today is to stand at a window looking across the river of modern acting. He belongs to a certain lineage of performers who turned the theater of emotion into a place of public honesty. He taught us how to be magnificent and, simultaneously, how to be humane. He has been guilty of excess, sure, and also of rare, pinpointed tenderness. Those contradictions are not flaws. They are the evidence of an artist unwilling to compromise, to trade power for safety. In the best of his work, there is a kind of moral risk that makes us lean forward. Will he do the thing he fears? Will he confess? Will he let himself be seen? Al Pacino's story is still, in many ways, unfinished. It is the story of a man who learned to convert the grit of his origins into a tempering fire for his art. It is a story of apprenticeship and obsession, of stages and screens, of long rehearsals and sudden, unforgettable moments in front of the lens. His filmography reads like a map of American anxieties in the late 20th century, about power, about family, about the cost of ambition, about the ways loneliness morphs into violence. But it is also, crucially, a testament to endurance, to the patience of an actor who will not be content with a single great success, but who continues to test himself against the hard geometry of character. If there is a final lesson in Pacino's life and work, it is this: acting is not performance, it is an ethical occupation. It asks the actor to be brave in feeling, honest in representation, and generous toward those whose lives are not their own. Pacino has given the world an enormous raft of such generosity, sometimes messy, sometimes incandescent, always honest, for students of the craft, for audiences who have found themselves reflected and reborn in his performances. His legacy is an instruction and an invitation to look for the life beneath the gesture, to find the human note that makes a role sing, and to remember that what we call greatness is often the result of a lifetime of small, uncompromising decisions. In the quiet hours, after the applause fades and the lights go out, the work remains. Actors will return to his films and his stage recordings not to copy his mannerisms but to study his devotion. Directors will remember him as the man who took a script and transformed it into an event, who made bold choices and expected the same from those who stood with him. Audiences will find in his performances a mirror that often discomforts and sometimes consoles, and that is the highest reward any artist can hope for, to alter the way other people feel about their own stories. So we end, not with the tidy notation of a life summed up, but with an opening. Al Pacino's life, like a great performance, leaves us wanting more insight, more risk, more of that particular luminous intensity that makes us feel we are watching someone who has decided to live for truth. For a man who learned to make the invisible visible, the films and plays remain as lanterns. We walk among them, and somewhere in the hush, his voice, that slow, endless drum, keeps us company, reminding us of the precarious, beautiful art of becoming.